Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another fresh episode of The Locker Line. As always, I'm your host, Ben Dubose, Rockets reporter based here in Houston. I'm again joined by Paulo Alves. He's out in Portugal. It's now the final week of August, so it's pretty much the most quiet time on the NBA calendar that you'll see all year. Training camp starts in about a month, so lots of people are out on vacations at the moment, but there are still a couple of active business-related storylines to focus on for the Rockets. In our last pod, which was on the NBA schedule release a couple weeks back, we finished up with a discussion in that final segment about Kevin Durant's next contract. It started at about the 50-minute mark, so if you haven't already listened and you want to hit up our archives, feel free. But in general, we put it as the final segment because, honestly, it feels inevitable that eventually something is going to get done on the KD front. You don't trade for Kevin Durant without having a plan to keep him around for more than 1 year. And also in the Kevin Durant case, there's not really a deadline. They can negotiate now, they can negotiate during the season, they can even negotiate exclusively next offseason in the period before free agency. Same thing as Fred VanVleet going into 2025 free agency, and Rockets negotiated the deal prior to that June 30th start date, or I guess the June 29th option date for what was the final year of his previous contract. So as far as KD, there's not really a lot of time pressure there. And I also don't think there's a ton of mystery as far as whether a deal gets done and what it might look like, because given his age and also factoring in NBA rules, the extension's only going to be for a year or two. And honestly, it's become pretty par for the course that superstar players and that 35 and up age bracket, they typically go year to year, maybe 1+1 when it comes to the contractual side. It just makes the most sense for both parties for a multitude of reasons, including the age 36 and age 38 rules in the CBA. But there is a bit more mystery when it comes to the next contract for Tari Eason, and so that's why we saved it for today's show. Rather than tacking it on to the final segment of a show that was already over an hour long, we figured let's just address this separately because there's a lot more to unpack on the Tari front. So let's start with the intel. A couple of days ago, Kelly Iko wrote this in The Athletic about the state of play between the Rockets and Tari. These are direct quotes from Kelly. There's been positive communication on both sides pertaining to Eason's extension, and the hope is that an agreement can be reached soon. The Rockets are dangerously close to the first apron, and ironing out an Eason contract would give them more certainty on their upcoming financial layout, while also avoiding a potentially awkward situation. Team sources would prefer to finalize an extension sooner rather than later, while understanding that it may drag out until closer to the start of the season. There's also the possibility that both sides can't come to terms and revisit this the following summer in restricted free agency, but the Rockets don't want it to be a lingering issue or distraction. That's the end of Kelly's report. Now, what's worth emphasizing here is that unlike KD, there actually is a deadline with Tari Eason. If the deal doesn't get done prior to the start of the regular season, which is October 21st, then Tari becomes a restricted free agent next summer. That's just the harsh reality. There's no way around it. And while being a restricted free agent does let the Rockets match any outside offer, it's pretty clear that there are some limits as to how far they would go financially. Otherwise, a deal would already be done. And all it takes is one team to make a big offer, and that can put you in a very uncomfortable position. Now, keep in mind that Jabari Smith Jr., another first-round pick from the same draft class back in 22, he was also extension eligible this offseason, and he already signed a 5-year deal nearly 2 months ago. As we pointed out before, the Rockets, they have incentives to get these deals done because they know their payroll is about to get way more expensive. All of these younger players coming up on their second contracts, most notably Amen Thompson getting a max deal in a couple of years. And then, as Kelly wrote in his story, it's obviously to their benefit to get financial clarity on those other contracts as soon as possible so they can figure out how to make especially that 27 to 28 year with Amen Thompson likely on a max deal and Kevin Durant on something reasonably close to it in all likelihood, it's going to be tough to fit all that in the second apron environment of the current NBA. And so the sooner they can get clarity on future contracts, the more that Eli Whitus and Rafael Stone can start planning all this out. So on today's show, I want to discuss why the risk profile with Tari is a bit different than it was for Jabari, because in my opinion, that's primarily why these negotiations are dragging a bit. And I also want us to make some guesses as to what a deal might look like if it gets done. But I want to start with what I hope is a point of consensus, which is that regardless of these talks, Tari is going to be on this team, and he should play a pretty important role this season on what we hope is a championship contender. The reason I bring that up is John Hollinger, also with The Athletic, formerly an NBA front office executive, he actually floated the idea of the Rockets potentially trading Tari. I'm going to read a few lines from his recent column about extension-eligible guys. Again, this is me quoting The Athletic. Even if the Rockets and Eason had a workable number, say 3 years for 65 to 70 million, another issue crops up. The Rockets might not want to commit to paying him yet. Houston has multiple decisions on whom to pay in the coming seasons, and the Rockets will be particularly expensive in 26-27 and 27-28, regardless, assuming Durant signs his extension. Because of that, one wonders if Houston might choose to strategically cash in its Eason stock before next season, and if so, whether that would be more easily accomplished without a contract extension. Again, that passage is from John Hollinger. Me personally, I just can't see it happening. And a lot of it comes down to exactly what we discussed in our KD segment a couple of weeks ago. There just aren't that many teams with significant cap space these days. And the few that do, they typically don't want to tie it up for several days on a restricted guy when the Rockets can just match after the fact. We've seen that all off season in 2025 when the markets for most of the restricted free agents have been pretty bad. Just ask Jonathan Kuminga of the Warriors, Cam Thomas of the Nets, Josh Giddey of the Bulls, and so on and so forth. So the bottom line here, I don't think the Rockets will be or should be that afraid of restricted free agency as it pertains to the worst case scenario here. And I'm also skeptical, even if you disagree with what Tari's restricted market would be, I'm skeptical as to what his trade value would be right now as an alternative. I mean, for starters, you don't trade for a 37-year-old Kevin Durant if you're not trying to win a championship immediately. And so if you replace Tari Eason from your rotation with a Josh Okogie or a Jayshawn Tate, you're going to be taking a step back. Now, in theory, you could trade Tari for someone who replaces his minutes, but then you have to factor in what his value actually is. And right now, I think that's unclear based on his leg issues, which I assume we're going to get into. For me, I just can't see another team trading an established good player on a good contract for Tari Eason right now, given the injury history. And then if it's a bad contract, it defeats the entire purpose of the negotiations. You might as well just keep Tari and pay him what he wants in that scenario. He at least has more upside. So in a very abstract sense, I can see why for some teams, a trade could make sense as a measure of last resort. But for this particular Houston team, I just don't think it makes sense. I think either you get a deal done the next few weeks, which I hope happens, or you play out the year as is, and then you take your chances with restricted free agency next summer, knowing that in 2025, that's been a very team-friendly environment for negotiations. So to me, those are the only two realistic options. I just can't imagine a trade making any sense here. Paolo, before we get into the specifics of the negotiations between the Rockets and Tari, are we in agreement on the trade aspect of it, primarily that it just doesn't make sense?
Oh yeah, 100%. I think from everything we've ever heard about what the Rockets think of Tari, I think they prioritize him even higher than Jabari, although his market value might not be as such because of his injury, but just the type of player that he is. And then you add on to that you're trying to contend here. You're like 1.5 million below the first apron. You're paying tax. You're not going to trade a guy that's making $5-7 million a year and giving you production that far outmatches that. It's not like the Rockets are going to trade him for future assets because that wouldn't make sense for a team that just traded for KD. And on the other hand, I disagree with the premise by Hollinger that says that you're cashing out on him or cashing in on him. That doesn't make sense either, because trading a guy who has 1 year left on his contract, even though he's restricted after, is only going to happen with a team that has already talked to his agent and is okay with whatever extension they need to sign to get him to stay there. I'm not even a trade for 1 year of Tari Eason. And so you're going to get a discounted value on Tari for that. And then at the same time, it needs what you said. You're never going to get the type of production from Tari from what you would get back for him on a salary like that. This meaning, let's say the Rockets don't want future assets, right? They want to play the helps now. Well, you're not going to find better, value for your money on a contract up to $7 million a year, which I think is what Tari makes, maybe $5 or $6 million on basically anywhere, unless you're getting another rookie back. And at that point, you would probably rather stay with the rookie contract that you already have, that you know what you can count on with him. So I think just trading him makes no sense at all. It goes against everything we've ever heard the Rockets talk about Tari Eason. Even if they cannot come to an extension, it still doesn't make sense to trade him because, well, he's going to play and he's going to be motivated to play because he's going to hit restricted free agency the year after. And the Rockets should be comfortable going into restricted free agents. And this is a perfect segue to talking about actual numbers because, as you talked about, few teams have cap space. Now, this offseason, there are a few teams with cap space. And Tari Eason is young and he would fit, a lot of the bottom feeder teams that are constantly there, like the Wizards and the Nets. It would fit their timeline to give Tari an offer, right? But then again, Tari doesn't really strike me as a guy that wants to, and knowing Mama Eason on Twitter, he doesn't really strike me as a guy that wants to go through another rebuild, especially having just gone through one. He seems like a guy that wants to win. And so even if that pays him the most money, restricted free agency also is always really, really, protective of the team because of what you said as well, which is you can offer him an offer sheet, but then you have that cap space tied up for a few days. And as much as you may want to tell me that teams have their deals agreed upon very early on, that goes away the moment you can't guarantee a guy a deal, right? You can have a pre-agreed deal. Let's say Tari Eason is the first option for a team, right? But they have a backup option in case Tari Eason doesn't sign. That backup option will never be very good because what player is going to subject himself to, we can pay you, I don't know, $17, $18 million a year, but only if we miss out on Tari Eason, only if a team that only if the Rockets don't match our offer for Tari Eason. Like we've seen last few years, they've tried to hide it by not leaking stuff the minute after the free agency opens, but the deals are very much pre-agreed upon, and even more than that, you rarely get new deals 2-3 days after free agency opens because that's what it would take for a team that holds out and offers Tari as an offer sheet and then has to, if that doesn't work out, go after other guys. So no team's going to be willing to do that. You can argue that the Nets this year I think the Nets still have cap space, I'm pretty sure, but that typically
use most of it for Michael Porter Jr.
Yeah, I know, but that typically doesn't happen, and it's just as the team, you always have control over what you want to do, and whatever team offered, like typically teams are okay overpaying for a guy to draw him out of a certain team in restricted free agency when there's a lot of upside cases there. Tari Eason's an awesome player, and there's upside with Tari Eason, obviously, but he's not exactly the guy that is going to be a good deal if he's overpaid, even as a role player. Like, as a role player, you have a ceiling as for what you can get paid, right? And that ceiling is like Tari Eason is already close to that ceiling, if that makes sense, on an extension projection upside as well. And so it's harder for a team to make the case that they should offer him, 20% above what his market value is to draw him out through restricted free agency to keep the Rockets from mathing. Right? Because if they keep the player, that contract is not going to be positive value early on. And because Tari is a role player, it doesn't really have much potential to ever become fair value in the future or become an asset that the team can then trade. That makes sense when you're talking about guys like Jonathan Kuminga or Cam Thomas who, have that star upside. At a certain point, like you can overpay Cam Thomas by 20% and make a consolidated bet that Cam Thomas is going to turn into a star, and at that point, he's going to be worth his contract. With Tari Eason, it's a little bit different. With Tari or Jabari, don't want to seem like I'm targeting Tari in specific here, but Tari or Jabari or any of the other guys that have signed contract extensions as guys that project to be role players, it's hard to make. They're not necessarily an upside play for teams. And so it's harder to justify all of the commitment that it takes to get a guy like that. And always without the certainty that you'll get him, right? So it just, to me, it will never make sense to trade. Tari's never going to get a good return. Doesn't make sense for the team that's trying to win. Tari's a really good player right now. So I guess I'll hand it back to you. It's just, I guess, I don't want to be throwing shots, but I guess it's kind of justified that John Hollinger isn't the GM anymore.
Oh, God. Woj agrees with you. God, Woj was savage on Hollinger back in the day. Although I will say, in fairness to Hollinger, the 3 years for $65 to $70 million, that actually makes a lot of sense. The numbers that he threw out, and we'll get to that.
Yeah, and to be fair to him, he did call Şengün being, really good. I think he had him like top 4 in the draft back in the day.
Yeah, good point. Anyway, I think the trade notion is especially undercut by the timing, because the same issues that the Rockets are having with projecting Tari's future value, other teams are going to have it as well. Now, that's different by next off season. If Tari goes out and has a healthy season and the leg issues are behind him and he shows more growth, as we hope that he will. But right now, I mean, the same issues that Tari is having, and we don't know this. There have been reports from Kelly Eco that suggest both sides are hopeful, so maybe they're not that far apart. But if you look at this as glass half empty, oh, why haven't they come to an agreement the way that the Rockets and Jabari did? Maybe they're far apart. Well, I think it's probably safe to assume that there would be that same gap in terms of what Tari and his agent want him to get versus what the team is willing to give with other teams as well, because everyone's going to have to consider the unique risk profile here coming off the last couple of years. Because look, he only played in 79 regular season games combined the last 2 years. And this is not just one fluky injury. No, this is a stress reaction in his lower leg that even after he had it surgically corrected in March of 2024, he still had issues with the following season. And it's inherent in the term stress reaction. It's not a one-off. This is not like when Jabari Smith broke a bone in his hand because someone swiped down on it, wrong place, wrong time at training camp, or it was a practice during the season, but same difference. And so clearly it was fluky. He came back, had no further issues. No, this is a cumulative toll that NBA minutes took on his body. And he had issues multiple times with that leg over multiple seasons. Now, I'm not saying that I think it's going to be a career-defining injury. No, there are plenty of examples, including Steven Adams last season, where guys aren't quite ready the first season after leg surgery. It takes them a year and a half, closer to 2 years. Steven called it a 2-year recovery process. And so, yeah, you can absolutely sell me on the idea that Tari is going to put all of this behind him starting this season, and that he really needs to be 2 seasons out from when he had the issues surgically corrected to be all the way back. That's totally fair. But every team in the league, not just the Rockets, is going to have concerns seeing a guy that played only 79 combined regular season games the last 2 years with a recurring issue in his lower left leg that's stress-related. And it's not like Ime Udoka or Steven Silas ran him into the ground. No, he hasn't exceeded 25 minutes per game in any of his 3 NBA seasons. So this is not like, oh, you just need to use him a little bit less. No, he had these issues just being used at a moderate level, coming off the bench, playing 20 to 25 minutes per game. So that's not meant to be overly pessimistic. Again, you can make a compelling argument that he should and will move past it this season. But until he does, any team is going to have to factor that into their decision-making in terms of what they're willing to offer him. So if the Rockets are hesitant, I suspect other teams would be as well. And so that further undercuts the logic of engaging in trade discussions, because you just wouldn't be able to get what you need if you're the Rockets in order for a deal to make sense. Tari wouldn't get the contract that he needs. You wouldn't be able to fetch the value return, i.e. a player that's clearly superior to Josh Okogie, Jae'Sean Tate, someone that's near the end of your bench right now. And so the trade path doesn't really make sense. The flip side, though, and this is why I think the negotiations are a little tricky, there's also a boom scenario with Tari. So we talked about the injury risk, and that's definitely the bust scenario. But there's also a boom. When you look at his advanced metrics, win shares, value over replacement player, he's been better than Jabari, at least on a per minute basis through 3 seasons in the NBA. There have been times we've made the argument right here on this podcast that he looks potentially like a young Kawhi Leonard if he develops more as a playmaker. And I wouldn't say that he took any steps back the last couple of years, or not even that he didn't take steps forward. It just got stunted by the injury concerns. So if you squint hard enough and you look at the advanced metrics, you can understand why Tari and his agent might be saying, hold on here. We want to get at least in the ballpark of what Jabari Smith Jr. got, because there's evidence that he could be even better and could have even more upside. I'm not saying I fully buy into that. What I'm saying is that they have a case that they can make. I think with Jabari, and this gets brought up on social media all the time, fans want to know, why did the Rockets get this deal done with Jabari Smith as soon as the negotiating window opened around July 1st? And now we're 2 months later and things are still going on with Tari. I think with Jabari, he was and is very projectable, both for the team and from his perspective. You know, we've talked about it before. He's very plug and play, super high floor. Maybe the ceiling is a little bit lower. I don't know if he has the playmaking, the shot creation to become a full-blown star, but he's going to be a winning player for a good team for a long time. There's no injury risk. He doesn't need the ball in his hands to be super effective. Good defender, very versatile, fits perfectly into the Ime Udoka defensive, team-oriented culture. Not that Tari doesn't, but I think Jabari defensively is more disciplined than Tari is, which gives him more utility. The bottom line is Jabari is a very projectable guy for the Rockets. They have a good idea as to what his future value to the team is going to be. And conversely, I think Jabari also knows, at least for the next few years, what his role is likely going to be in Houston. And it's not going to be one where he's likely to have the type of breakout statistics to where he can clearly get a much richer contract. Because as long as Kevin Durant, Amen Thompson, Alperen Şengün are all here and all healthy, Jabari is going to be the fourth option at best. So even if he does develop in other areas, which he's just 21, 22 years old, he's certainly capable of doing, he's probably not going to all of a sudden start putting up the big numbers that will have you looking back in a couple of years and saying, wow, 5 years for $122 million, under $25 million in average annual value, he shouldn't have done that. No, nobody's going to be saying that. I think it's very clear from the team's perspective and also Jabari's perspective what his role is going to be, what his value is likely going to be, at least from a statistical perspective, which feeds into what these players can command. And so it made it very easy for the team and Jabari to come to an agreement. With Tari, there's more of a boom or bust debate to be had. And we went through the upside, we went through the injury history. I would also point out, and this is a minor thing, but Tari did not have a good playoff run against the Warriors. Of the 8 rotation players, he was by far the worst when you look at the on-off court differential. And I'm not making a huge deal out of this. One opponent, a small sample size of 7 games. I just want to note it for the record because as much criticism as Jalen Green got, and I understand why, he's your leading scorer, there's more expected of him. Tari arguably underachieved even more, and people in the building weren't that surprised. There was an expectation going in that the Warriors were a bad matchup for him because, at least at this stage of his career, how dependent Tari is on being super aggressive defensively, being a menace in transition, and the Warriors are very disciplined, and postseason basketball often becomes a slugfest, very half-court oriented, and to this point, that's not the most conducive to Tari's skill set. Now, can he develop over time? For sure. But to this point, that doesn't play to his strengths. And so from a team perspective, it goes back into sort of how you analyze those metrics. In the regular season, on a per-minute basis, if you squint hard enough and you say, hey, if Tari's healthy, yeah, you can argue that these are numbers that could lead to a very, very good player. But then another part of the boom or bust equation, you could make an argument that unlike Jabari, maybe Tari's game doesn't translate as well to the playoffs because some of the skills that it takes for him to be at his best, at least in his first 3 seasons, don't always translate in the super disciplined half-court style that we see in the playoffs. So that's my guess as to what's going on here. And again, as far as the downside risk, I think it's much more about the injury than it is 7 games against one opponent. That's a very small sample. I just bring it up as context because if we're going to talk about it a lot with Jalen Green, as we did, and justifiably so, we should at least mention it with Tari. I think it's not a huge factor in negotiations, but it's just a little bit of the downside risk. I think the larger point here, unlike Jabari, there's just a lot more volatility when it comes to projecting out the future of Tari Eason over the next 2, 3, 4, as many as 5 years. That's, I think, the longest contract that he would be eligible for. And so that's why these negotiations, in my opinion, have continued to drag out. It's not so much that the Rockets are saying Jabari is clearly better or more important than Tari. I think it's just easier for them to project his future. Paolo, what's your assessment as far as the risk profile with Tari and your take on why these negotiations have taken a lot more time?
Yeah, I think it's hard to read because, well, there's many things we can go on about. First of all, addressing the injury thing, right? Makes me wonder what the Rockets are actually offering him. Like, is he getting offered the same thing Jabari got? How much lower than that are we offering? Because I think let's imagine there's no injury, right? I think on most teams, Tari would take or would demand less than what Jabari got. Jabari is the higher pick. He's, has the high draft pedigree. He can play in a number of different types of teams. He's a more unique archetype in the league. Obviously shoots better, which is a pretty big plus. Performs better in the playoffs. I think it's the easiest way to get to it is try and compare with other guys. And Tari has a very comparable guy right on his team right now. Makes me wonder. I'm assuming that's the ceiling. I don't think Tari is asking for more than Jabari. I don't think it would make sense from a real life perspective without factoring in the injury. And when you factor in the injury, then it's a home run that it shouldn't be higher than Jabari's. Mainly because, well, I know in the NBA, we like to sometimes close our eyes to a lot of these details because young guys often get paid based on potential, right? You either have potential to be a star, in which case you're going to be overpaid early on, or you don't. And a lot of times when you sign deals as a guy that doesn't really project to be a superstar, you're going to get very budget deals, and in your first contract you're typically still underpaid. We can go back. I'm not going to talk about the specific numbers. We'll get into that in a little bit. But just talking about the last 2 drafts, I think very easily would argue Danny Avdija from the Portland Trail Blazers at this point, back then with the Wizards, got underpaid. I think he's underpaid right now. Josh Green, the same thing. Okongwu, probably a fair deal. Devin Vassell at the time, well, he's obviously not projected to be what people thought he would be, especially with less usage. But I think at the time, the money that he got, he was underpaid. Aaron Nesmith, the shooter from the Pacers who was just essential in a playoff run, got a 3-year, $33 million deal, and I think he was the 11th pick from memory. I don't have it off the top. Peyton Pritchard, same thing, got severely underpaid, right? Guys that don't necessarily project to have superstar upside typically get underpaid. On the same draft class, obviously LaMelo Ball was already a star, so no questions there. Anthony Edwards was already a star, no questions there. Tyrese Halliburton, the same thing. But look at Desmond Bane, right? Desmond Bane is a guy that has a superstar upside, or at least a second best guy on a championship team, depending on construction. He got $200 million over 5 years, right? So there's a very big delta from guys that project to be role players to guys who project to be superstars. When you're paying their first rookie extension, you're most of the time betting on upside, and upside comes at a very high premium. So from that perspective, Tari is obviously on the role player type of contract extension. And so I think placing the ceiling at Jabari Smith Jr. is fine, especially considering the injury, which makes me think, what are the Rockets actually offering, and how concerned are they with the injury history? Because if I'm Tari, right, if they offer me, like, Jabari just got
5
over,
22,
yeah, but that's basically what, 24 million a year, if I'm not mistaken?
roughly.
No,
Yeah.
roughly, yeah. So if you offer Tari 20 million a year over 5, I think he probably tries to push for a little bit more, maybe some incentives, but I think that's a pretty fair evaluation, considering that on your own team, you've set the precedent at Jabari, right? Then you bring into it the metrics in the playoffs. Advanced metrics may classify him as having the worst playoffs than what your typical box score stats say. He had like a lower points per game season, but he also average, but he also played less minutes. He shot 37% from three, which makes me think on 3 attempts a game, which makes me think that he didn't necessarily have playoff jitters. I think those typically show up more in the shooting, right? He got a steal and a block on 18 minutes a game. If you average that out to 36, which is obviously full, that's over 4 stocks a game. So he still had an impact as far as, the Terror Twins moniker and all of that, and causing a little bit of chaos. Obviously, the Warriors are a tough team to do that against. But this to say that he still was somewhat impactful, but he wasn't as impactful as Jabari was. I think it's not questionable at all. And so that helps the Rockets place a ceiling at what Jabari got. You performed worse than Jabari. You are a worse shooter than Jabari. And it's easier to find 6'8" defensive wings than it is to find 6'10", not sharpshooter at this point, but guys that project to be sharpshooters that can switch 1 through 5 and all of that type of stuff. So you should be both Jabari, and then you should be both Jabari because of your injury history as well, right? And so I think that it's an easy argument to make, and it's a reasonable argument to make to his agent and to Tari himself. So 4 million below from an AAV standpoint makes sense to me. Now, what I'm thinking might be the issue here is how many years. We've talked about this before as far as extensions go, but when you're not a max guy, typically there's a massive incentive for teams to give as long a deal as possible, as long as the guy doesn't really have bust potential. And I don't think Tari has much of a bust potential other than the injury. And so, why is that? Because these are going to be fixed numbers, right? They're not tied to a percentage of the cap, most likely. And so, as the cap typically outperforms the 8% raises that you get in bird rights. They might not next year in specific, but they typically do, which means that the contract gets more friendly as the contract goes on, right? And that's when you have to start looking at the age, right? Jabari is younger than Tari. Tari is 24 years old today, and he's going to be 24 entering the season. A 5-year deal means he hits free agency at 29. Nowadays, 29 is okay for you to still get another 5-year tag on top of that, or a 4-year deal if you hit free agency. But it's still not ideal. I think if you are a team, you're probably more comfortable getting a 4-year deal to a guy that's 28, maybe 27, right? Even if it isn't based on upside, it's based on the security that the team that signs you will have, that your skill set won't fall off, and especially a guy that has an athleticism to defend multiple positions. That makes sense. Now, that might be a little bit of an outdated mentality because, Dorian Finney-Smith just got paid being 33 or 34, I don't have it off the top, and he's 32. All right, but he got paid for 4 years. That's where the confusion came from. So 4 years up until he will be on the older side.
Right.
You got Nicholas Batum, who's an example of a 3-and-D wing that got paid until he was really up then in age. Robert Covington got paid until he was really in age. So guys, 3-and-D wings are getting paid still, but I do understand from an agent standpoint, you probably want to be getting your second contract around age 27, 28, not age 29, which is what I would have with 5 years. The question is, for the Rockets, if they're not getting 5 years, then that AAV has to lower because you're not getting as much of an incentive. Like, if you're giving up value at the end of the contract by having one fewer year, then you probably need a lower AAV to make up for that, right? For that upside that you're losing. At the same time, is Tari pressing for a player option, which will make sense for a guy that has some injury concerns at this point. The Rockets have shown to be very averse to player options. The only contract I can remember that has a player option is Fred VanVleet's deal.
Jalen Green did, but there's a very specific reason for that I'll get into in a minute. Go on.
Yeah. Fred's deal is completely different. It's not as long term. It's 1 year. He took a massive pay cut. It makes sense for him to have that player option, and it won't affect the Rockets' planning for next season, whether he takes it or not. Tari Eason jumping from, what, let's call it a $23-24 million deal in 2029 or 2030, versus him jumping from that 25 million figure to, well, at that point, with the cap space from those years, which will be massively increased, probably by about 50%, you're talking about a contract that's 25, which would jump from a cap hit from 25 to what, probably 35, 40 million at that point. That's probably what a role player will get paid by that point. Having that jump be a year early is massive, and especially when you can't really tell if you're going to have that jump or not, because at any point Tari may get hurt, and now you got that extra year. So the Rockets seem to be very mindful of cap planning further out, and I think that's something that really gives them an edge versus other teams, and they've been complimented for it. And having that edge means that you're not open. I would guess you're not open to giving player options. So that might be a sticking point as well. And I don't know if I was going to move on to comparisons to other extensions, but I don't know if you want to kind of clarify that Jalen Green stuff and any other point that you may want to make before I get into the more nerdy stuff.
Yeah, I'll just point out, for starters, the Fred extension, because the player option is in 26, it's irrelevant. The years of concern for the Rockets are 2027 onward. And that's where I think they'll be sticklers for player options. Now, some might say, why did they give Jalen Green a contract that has a player option in 27? Well, I don't think they 100% knew this time a year ago that they'd be where they are right now and that their future outlook would be what it is at the moment. And I still don't think they wanted to give Jalen Green that player option. That's something they don't give out much of in the Rafael Stone, Eli Whitus era. But I just think when you look at the other alternatives for Jalen Green, it would have been way too risky to give Jalen Green a 5-year deal. I don't think you have Kevin Durant, at least not on the terms that you currently do. If you had given Jalen the 5-year deal, I think the Suns would have found that too risky. They want an out. They need an out. If Jalen doesn't hit at the higher levels, which is what the shorter term deal does, it gives some protection to the team. And then if you had just drawn a hard line and said, well, you don't take a deal on our terms, we'll just wait until 2025 restricted free agency. Well, if you had done that, Jalen Green would have been untradeable this offseason. He would have been untradeable until at least the 26 deadline window. So getting a deal done with Jalen Green during that negotiating window last year, that rookie scale window, they had to do it if they wanted the option to use him as salary filler, which they ultimately did to bring in Kevin Durant. And the player option was simply the cost of doing business. In my opinion, it was either the player option or going 5 years. And I think Jalen just had not, and he still hasn't proven enough consistently to where you'd feel comfortable giving him a max or near max deal for 5 years. That's too risky to the team, too risky to his future trade value. So that's why I think Jalen was a total outlier as far as the team option. It was the cost of doing business if you wanted to avoid 5 years and avoid having him as a restricted free agent and thus be untradeable without his consent this offseason.
Yeah, and there's an extra. I thought this is what you were going to talk about, and I double checked real quick. I just searched it up. And there's another thing, which is Jalen Green's deal was not a max contract. The player option came at the exact point where he became eligible for the 7 to 9 year max. So you have the first type of max deal, and then you have a little jump when you complete 6 years of service, and then you have another jump when you're 10 plus years, which is the full on max. If you don't become eligible for it through all NBA teams or MVP or all of that stuff. So the player option comes in at the end of 6 years, which in a case where Jalen hits, makes him be able to hit free agency again at the point where he makes that jump, which is disproportionate when you're not on a max deal, and is not really an issue for most guys if they are on max deal, because it just doesn't matter as much at that point. So there was an extra incentive there. But I don't know if you had anything else.
To segue into the numbers. So I think there are generally 3 schools of thought. And there's one, and I think we're in alignment on what it is, that in-between path. And that's why I think Hollinger's proposal of 3 for 65 to 70 million makes a lot of sense. So I agree with you as far as the parameters. The upper level would be average annual value around what Jabari got, around 24 million a year. You can't justify at this point in time paying him more given the injury risk. The lower end is going to be about, I'd say 16, 17 million annually, because if you go any lower than that, you'd be in mid-level exception territory, and Tari's a better player, assuming relative health, than an MLE type guy. So I think we're looking at somewhere between 16 and 24 million in average annual value, probably around the midpoint, which is about 20. And so we're talking about years, and we're talking about player options. And I mentioned the 3 paths. The reason I think it's going to be in that in-between range, the first path would be 5-year deal, most money possible, along the lines of what Jabari got. You could make the argument that maybe Tari, after the health scares, wants as much financial security as he can get. But if that was the case, why wouldn't a deal already be done? If both sides were willing to do that, and Tari was committed to taking the best offer he could get from the Rockets, and they're the only team that can offer him a deal in 25, just to get that financial security as soon as possible, I mean, there's risk of waiting until October, the deadline, the period between July 1st when the window started and October 21st. Injuries can happen then. I mean, that's when he first started having the stress reaction after his rookie season. It started in the off season. So there's risk in waiting. If his appetite for risk was so low that he wanted as many years at as much money as he could get, I think a deal would already be done. And the Rockets would love to have the financial certainty that comes with that. He hasn't done the Jabari deal or anything like it. I think probably a little bit lower. You mentioned 5 for 100 earlier. I don't think that's where we're headed because, in my opinion, if it was, a deal would already get done. I mean, maybe you can argue that his agent thinks he can leverage the Rockets into giving a little bit more by waiting, but I don't know. I'm skeptical of that. The other path that I don't think is happening is waiting until 26. I think it's possible, but I don't think it's the preferred route for anybody because both the Rockets and Tari, the reports we've seen this offseason have suggested hope that a deal can be reached. I think you would be setting the table if either side wasn't confident in reaching a deal this offseason. You don't want this to be a storyline heading into training camp and the preseason. You would want to table it and say, and there's an easy way you can justify tabling it. You can say, look, this is a very unique risk profile given the injuries. He just needs to go out and have a healthy season. Maybe he wants to bet on himself, to use the Fred VanVleet line, and just wait until he posts a healthy season. He'd be in a better position to negotiate next summer. I guess maybe that's counteracted a little bit of being a restricted free agent. Now that's depressed markets for the restricted guys this summer. But the point is, if it just wasn't possible to get a deal, if the sides were just so far apart, you wouldn't have the leaks that they're hopeful. You would have framing that this just isn't the right time and both sides need to see what happens. Tari would be in a better position to negotiate, and the Rockets would have more confidence in their investment if he goes out and has a strong season. But we're not hearing those leaks. The leaks we're hearing are that both sides are hopeful. So what that tells me is that it's somewhere in between. It's not wait until 26, but it's also not a 5-year deal at the most guaranteed money possible. And so I think we're probably looking at a compromise scenario where both sides get a little bit of protection. Just like with the Jalen Green deal, if it's 2 or 3 years, the team gets the protection of not investing 5 years at a relatively high average annual value if the player goes bust. And in Tari's case, I think it's probably more related to injury than his style of play. But I think the same principle holds. And then the player is protecting his upside a little bit by being able to get his next contract sooner if that boom scenario hits. But where I think things are different between Jalen and Tari, and this is where I think there's a sticking point, I can't see the Rockets giving a player option. I think they did with Fred a couple of months ago because that's 26. That's largely inconsequential. But when we get into these years where the second apron is going to be in play, they want as much certainty as possible. And so leaving yourself open to a scenario where the player can play his way into a much larger contract prior to his free agency simply because of that option, that's risky, especially when it's not within your control to just let them go. Okay, well, they could opt in. That lack of control in that 27 and beyond window, that's risky. I don't see the Rockets doing it. I know they did with Jalen, but I think that's a fairly unique case. And they also weren't as 100% sold on being a contender in that window the way they are right now. So I think Tari would love a deal. Obviously not the same average annual value because Jalen was in the 30s. Tari's not going to get that. But I think Tari would love something. Hollinger proposed 3 years for 65 to 70 million, which would be average annual value a little over 20. I think that makes a ton of sense. I think Tari and his agent would love that deal with a player option after the second year. That to me is too risky for the Rockets. And I think that's where we're at with these negotiations. And the good news is that this is such a small gap that sooner or later, I think the sides can come together. But my gut tells me that's the sticking point. And I don't think the band is as narrow as 65 to 70. I think it could be as low as maybe 3 for 55, as high as 3 for 80. Again, I think anywhere within that average annual value range of 16 to 24 is in play. But I just think it's the player option. The Rockets want the certainty, and Tari and his agent want the upside of, hey, if he hits, if he gets healthy and gets back on that young Kawhi Leonard trajectory again, he wants the ability to opt out, especially because he's an older player anyway. And so he's not that far out from his true prime years, unlike Jabari. I think that's the sticking point. And so my guess is that's where we're heading, a deal that's not 5 years, but also not super short. And it just comes down to, it's less about the average annual value and it's more about the years, the flexibility, and both sides are just trying to negotiate the best deal they can. Ultimately, that's why my gut tells me a deal gets done. This is pretty small in the grand scheme of negotiations. It's a manageable gap, but that's my guess as to where things are at. 3 years, somewhere between 55 and 80 million in value, and the player option potentially is the sticking point. That's my guess. Paolo, you want to throw out your nerdy comparables and I guess the numbers that you've come to?
Yeah, so first thing I want to throw out is we can't forget that this is only happening because Jabari already signed this deal. Because up until the last second of the extension window last season, we thought Jalen and Sengun were not going to get extended, and then they were. Which means that up until I don't think either side caved at the end of the deadline. I think both sides were very close. And at the end of the deadline, someone caved on a minor thing, like on a maybe 2 million in AAV, something close to it, right? And I think this is the case as well.
And by the way, I meant to throw out the Sengun comparable for Jabari. I know they're different styles of players, but I think in both cases, the Rockets were very sold on what their future projections would be. And so that's why I think the Rockets were very comfortable giving 5 years for Sengun. Now, I know he's closer to the max than Jabari, but I think that's why those are 5-year players. It's not that Tari or Jalen last year don't have paths to where they could be in that same tier as a player. There's still absolutely a world where Tari can end up a better player than Jabari, but it's just Jabari is very projectable. There's no injury risk. And so that's why they're confident in 5 years. And I think it's the same thing with Sengun a year ago. Very projectable, very safe. There's no way the deal ages badly. And so that's why they're comfortable doing the 5 years. That's why I think they're probably a little bit more hesitant with Tari. Sorry for interjecting. Just wanted to mention that when we were talking about the Sengun comparable.
Yeah. And so personally, we don't really have all the information as far as what Tari Eason's injury looked like and looks like from a outlook perspective for the rest of his career. But still, as far as injury risks are concerned, right, Tari is 24 years old. He's going into his prime. You should limit how much you can credit an injury concern at this point because of how young he is. That being said, only the Rockets know how much they should be worried about that injury case, right? My overarching point that I was trying to make, and I think I ended up making it, is that I think they're close, and I don't think there's any major differences. And otherwise, at this point last year for Sengun and Jalen, the reports weren't as optimistic as they are with Tari right now.
Agreed.
And so makes me think, and they got a deal done, and most people would agree that the Jalen deal obviously wasn't a good deal in hindsight, but the Sengun deal was a home run. And so I think with Tari, they're probably really close. And I think 2 million in AAV or 3 million in AAV is less of a sticking point than a player option or a team option or a non-guarantee or something like that. So I really do think that they're really close. And it's a point of now they're just, holding on to until the last second, just like they did last year to see which side caves. But I do think that at the end of the day, I don't think the difference is large enough that it will make it to restricted free agency. That's my bet, obviously without any inside knowledge. But moving on from that, I wanted to go into what deals have looked like for other guys. I want to first point out that the Jabari Smith deal is the outlier when it comes to timing. So much so that you look at the rest of the NBA, obviously, and the only guys that have signed rookie extensions are Paolo Banchero, Jalen Williams, and Chet Holmgren, who are the max guys, at which point, well, there wasn't really much to negotiate there, so the deals already got done. Now, when we look at, well, first let's establish it's not the same an extension on a guy coming off that's going to restricted free agency, coming off his rookie deal that are typically younger, and extensions with guys that are free agents, even if they play the same position. So I'm going to throw out the Mikal Bridges of the world, the OG Ananobis of the world, all of the premium 3-and-D wings that have signed extension that are already veterans, right? So looking at last year and 2 years ago, guys that signed rookie extensions at below max value that are kind of in the same bracket as Tari, we have obviously higher quality players and lower quality players. But I have calculated what the cap hit was then and what it would look like now from an AAV perspective. Basically, 2 years ago, the salary cap was, basically over the last 2 years, each season, the salary cap has jumped 10%, which means that a deal that was signed 2 years ago needs to have that 10% attached to or added to it for it to be what it was last season. And a deal signed last season needs an extra 10% to be what it would be this season. And with all of that in mind, basically equating the deal to what the percentages of the cap that it would be this season, or if it was signed this season, obviously kicks in next season, the numbers look like this, right? I think on the upper end, you have Jaden McDaniels, who was coming off of a career year. This season, he wasn't as good shooting from three, but obviously that Timberwolves run to the Western Conference Finals, with all of that, his value got boosted. He signed for 31.6 million AAV on a 5-year extension. I think Tari Eason, obviously Jaden McDaniels has less of an injury concern. Tari Eason is obviously not as good as he is and up to this point, and he's not as important to the team as Jaden McDaniels was to the Wolves at that point. Gotta take into consideration, Jaden McDaniels was probably the third best player on the Wolves. Obviously, Tari with the Rockets is lower down the pecking order, especially with KD coming. So I think that shows us that Tari Eason should be well below this number. Then you have Devin Vassell at 32.6 million. At that point, Devin Vassell was looking like someone who had some star upside as a shooting guard, very lengthy, was coming off a career year shooting from three. Obviously, I think that's very, very upper end. We've already established that the upper end for Tarvi is probably about what Jabari got. That's probably the most valid comparison. Trey Murphy plays the same position, got 30 million AAV. Obviously, on the very upper end, this season he obviously broke out from a volume perspective and his percentages came down. But at that point, he was a guy that for the last 3 years had shot near 40% from three, with more length than Tari and a good defender. Obviously, not as good as Tari, but being a high volume 40% shooter while being a lengthy wing gives you, that type of money. You obviously have Jalen Johnson, who was coming off his breakout year, near all-star numbers, some forward hub of playmaking type stuff as well. Obviously, a switchable defender. He got 33 million a year. I think there's some upside projection on that as well. And he's obviously met it with the second season where he's been very good. So these are, the not a superstar, but a very, very, very good role player number, right? For guys that are already established as that. I think we established for the upper level that Tari's ceiling is Jabari Smith's number, which is 24 million a year, around that. Now look at the lower numbers, right? There's three guys I wanna look at. There's Isaiah Stewart from the Pistons, who doesn't play the same position and doesn't really have as flexible of a skill set as Tari does, but he got $18 million a year. I don't think in good faith you can argue that Tari Eason is a worse player than Isaiah Stewart or projects to be. So I think the lower end, basically, limit is 18 million a year. And there's two other examples that kind of break the mold a little. There's Josh Green, who is making 16.6 or would be making 16.6 million AAV when you look at what he would make if the extension were to be signed this season. I think Josh Green is underrated, but I don't think he's gotten the chance to, or at that point had the chance to show what his game is about. I think he's a really good 3-and-D wing, or maybe a 3-and-D guard on that kind of middle ground between the two. I think he's a worse play. I think he's a worse player than Isaiah Stewart, so I'm going to throw him out completely. And then you have Denya Biha, who would be making 16.5 million a year. And I think he's just an outlier from the perspective of he haven't broken out yet. That people weren't really projecting him to be what he is today, which is I think he has some star potential as well. But I think due to that contract being signed before he broke out, it's not really a valid comparison as well. It might look senseless to be throwing out these numbers that I don't think are comparable, but I think it makes sense for people who are really digging into the numbers to show why these numbers don't really make sense for Tari, even though they're lower than the minimum that we've already established. These are outliers, right? Tari might be an outlier himself, but I don't think he would be to the extent of these guys. And so I think we're looking at two main numbers. It's Isaiah Stewart, the lower end at 18 million, and Jabari Smith, the higher end at 24. And that's a pretty big delta. But how does that help us projecting a contract, right? I think the difference between 18 million AAV, as long as it's a flat contract, the difference between 18 million AAV and 24 million AAV is not a deal breaker shouldn't be a deal breaker for the team as long as they get 5 years. And why is that? I think the Rockets can come to the table and propose 18 million AAV, right? And Tari asks for 24. I think I would be willing to go as high as probably not the 24 from a kind of locker room dynamic standpoint, but up to the 23 if Tari gave me the 5 years. If Tari doesn't want to give me, so basically I'm willing to give him what Jabari was 5 years, 122. I would give Tari 5 years, 118 if he gives me the 5 years without any options. On the other side, if Tari Eason doesn't want to give me the 5 years, he only wants to give me 4, I'm not getting that value at the end. I'm probably not going to 23. I'm probably sticking at 21. If Tari only wants to give me 3 years, I'm probably not breaking 20. If Tari only wants a 2-year deal, I'm probably letting it go to free agency and seeing what it looks like, because at that point, there's not really any incentive for the Rockets to take the deal, I don't think. So this to say that obviously we established lower limit, upper limit, and where we land in the AAV scale, to me, is related to how many years you're willing to give, which would make sense and fits the timeline. Once you establish those two limits, you're basically 90% confident that you're going to reach a deal, because the gap isn't large enough for a deal to break down, except for one case, which would be Tari not being willing to sign more than 2 years, which really doesn't make sense from the perspective of a player that he himself has some injury concerns about himself, right? He wants to lock up generational money on his first extension, right? So I think this is a pretty good read on what the situation might be. You're sitting at a point where I would be very surprised if a deal doesn't happen. And you can kind of imagine on a sliding scale based on team control, how much the Rockets will be willing to pay for each year of team control. Each year of team control means a higher value per year. And basically, you can use precedent both within the team and outside of the team around the league. And I don't think these contract negotiations are really as complicated as probably Şengün's were. I think with Şengün, it was a lot harder to kind of you could have much more extreme positions than you can with Tari. With Şengün, you could say, hey, we don't think you're a max guy, and Şengün thinks he's a max guy, and all of a sudden there's a breakdown in negotiations and nothing happens. Because there's not really a middle ground between those two stances. With Tari Eason, as we've just established, there is very much a middle ground and the delta isn't as big. And so you can pretty confidently say that you're going to reach an agreement, while at the same time not having it agreed upon now and not having it agreed upon up until the deadline because of how much inside that sliding scale you can move up or down. And at that point, it's not really anybody caving. It's more that, well, the Rockets established, hey, we have these 4 options for contracts, 3-year, the 4-year, and the 5-year deal with different AAVs. Which one do you want to take? And then at that point, Tari has a decision on his hands to try and pick between those options. And at the same time, I would argue that Tari is probably waiting on Cam Thomas, Kuminga, and I forget who the other guy is who is currently a restricted free agent, Josh Giddey. I think at this point, Tari is probably waiting for those deals to use them as
what the alternative is.
Yeah, no, and to see it himself and to use it as leverage in the negotiations, and the Rockets do as well, which is why you hold out until the last possible second, which is why you can have this weird dichotomy where both sides are very confident they'll reach a deal because the framework's there and the options are there. But both sides are holding out until the last possible second because a new factor may arise that changes those negotiations. So you can, at the same time, not have a deal in sight from a time perspective, but from a structural perspective, you're confident that a deal will be done anyways, which I think is something that to me was really hard to figure out. Like, I spent a few hours today trying to figure out how that would make sense because it's kind of hard to understand why, well, you're close on a deal, but at the same time, you're going to take a full 1.5 more months to reach an actual deal. Like, are you haggling over, $200,000 here? No, you're haggling over what you're willing to compromise from a year's perspective versus what AAV you get for those extra years that you're willing to compromise. So, and then obviously plugging that into with the possible factors that may alter the negotiations altogether. So, yeah, I don't know. I think that was very lengthy, but I think I did a pretty good job kind of that out.
I will say Isaiah Stewart, according to SpotRack, his cap hit is $15 million a year. His apron salary is at 16, but I think it would be 18 if you extrapolated.
All of the numbers are if this deal was signed this off.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that. Yeah, that's where I thought you were going because, yeah, inflating 2023 negotiations to the 2025 environment.
Exactly. Okay, all of the numbers that I said are with that in mind.
That makes sense. Just wanted to make sure because I saw the 18 and I was like, I think that's a little rich, but I understand what you're saying now. Yeah. Okay, I think that's a fair guideline as far as where things are at. I agree with you that it's more likely than not to get done simply because if Tari wanted a deal strictly based on the data and assuming full health moving forward, i.e. the most rose-colored glasses view, if he was hell-bent on that, you would hear a lot more uncertainty about whether a deal would get done because I don't think the Rockets are that close in that environment. I think they want a deal that accounts for that risk and the fact that all indications are that the sides are hopeful of a deal being reached. That tells me that a deal isn't that far apart. It's just in contrast to Jabari, and I think that's what sort of threw everybody off. People wondering why did the deal with Jabari get done so quickly? Well, Jabari is, as you mentioned, Paolo, the outlier at a few levels. Really, he's the only guy in the entire NBA outside of the true max guys that's gotten a deal done. So I think just at a few levels, Jabari is a very rare case. Şengün, I mentioned that as a comparable from a year ago, but shoot, even Şengün went down to the deadline on that final deadline day last October. So it's really not that alarming. Most of these negotiations do drag out. Jabari was an outlier for whatever reason. Tari is more the norm, but all indications are the sides are close enough that a deal can probably get reached. The Rockets have incentive to get a deal done earlier for that stability, for that knowledge. And so my bet is that a deal actually does get done. It just may take until training camp in October. Final point I will make, and I don't think you were disagreeing with me, Paolo, but I just want to clarify for the audience. You mentioned that Jalen Steele wasn't good. From a value perspective, that's probably right. But it was better than not doing a deal at all, because if you didn't do a deal at all, he wouldn't have been trade eligible this offseason other than working with him as a restricted guy, and then he would have all control. And then conversely, if you had done a longer deal with Jalen, that wouldn't have been as appealing to a team like the Suns because they would have been on the hook more knowing what we now know about Jalen after his 4th season. So I agree with you that the Jalen deal wasn't good from a value perspective, but you were still better off to do it than not doing it with the full benefit of hindsight. That's the one distinction that I would make. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, basically you're saying that, or you're saying, and it is true that the KD deal can't happen if you don't have Jalen Green signed to his contract, because the Rockets wouldn't have the filler and Fred VanVleet would have to be the outgoing salary. And at that point, with that extra factor in, I'm not sure if the Rockets would have still done the deal. And because even if Jalen was a restricted free agent and he was willing to go to the Suns as outgoing salary as a restricted free agent, even if it's a $30 million deal, that only counts as $15 million outgoing.
Yep.
Right. And we would have that plus Dylan Brooks' salary, which would be total up to, I think, 35 million or something close, or 36 million, which is not enough to match KD's 50 something million figure. So yeah, it was 100% not a good value deal, but it was still worth it to pay a premium by dumping Jalen's negative deal, which whatever premium that was, whether it was the second round picks or whatever it was still worth it to pay that extra premium to be able to make the deal while still keeping Fred. Basically, at that point, the picture becomes, would you rather not have Fred and have 2 or 3 second round picks that you paid to dump Jalen's salary, or would you rather, as we have now, not have those second round picks but have Fred? And I think from the perspective of a team that's trying to win now, you would definitely rather have Fred, and I think the front office would definitely rather have Fred. But before we move on to, I think you're going to close now, I will say that for the people watching that are also Westeros fans, the first AB for Jordan was a 4-pitch walk, as everybody expected.
And then Christian Walker popped out. Yeah, that's going to be the big question. Half a Jordan Alvarez day, by the way. But yeah, how much protection does he have behind him? Christian Walker's gotten better, that's for sure. But there was an issue when Correa was in the 4 spot. There wasn't a lot of protection behind him. He's really picked up since going to number 2. That's where if they're going to stick Jordan at 4, and I understand why, I hope Christian Walker stays good because we saw in this first at bat a 4-pitch walk and then Christian Walker pops out. That's going to be the big challenge. There is going to be a point where it's not like the Jose Abreu days where the lineup just falls off a cliff, but there's a little bit of a decline where you'd rather face the guy on the on-deck circle. So hopefully Christian continues to do what he's largely done since July 4th and is capable enough that Jordan still gets some opportunities. Anyway, as far as our Rockets podcast, I'll close the loop on Jalen by saying that honestly, I think the Suns probably prefer Jalen than Fred as well. Not that his deal is universally positive, but unlike Fred, who would largely be a salary dump, I mean, maybe if you squint hard enough, you can say Fred being a veteran point guard could be something comparable to Chris Paul a few years ago when they found lightning in a bottle of the CP3 and Booker Perry. But more realistically, I think the Suns in their situation, they want the upside bet of Jalen as well. They just wouldn't want the upside bet if it was a 5-year deal. But if it's 2 or 3, that's more palatable. And so I think for the Suns as well, Jalen on the deal that he's on, I don't think they necessarily wanted Jalen, but they did not want him either. There was enough there, and the contract was reasonable enough that it made sense for them. It was a reasonable bet. And that's where, to put a bow on this entire episode, trust the Rockets in these types of negotiations. The closest thing to a loss for Rafael Stone in his negotiating tenure would be the Jalen Green negotiations. That's the one you could argue about the most. And it was still, at the end of the day, clearly a win. The other contracts, they are incredibly positive, incredibly team-friendly. Sam Quinn of CBS Sports recently referred to him as the best negotiator in the game, Rafael Stone, that is. And Eli Whitus deserves a lot of credit as well because he really does their future financial planning, I've been told. So you can trust the Rockets that they're not going to do anything irresponsible. We have a long sample in the Rafael Stone administration of them getting deals done on their terms. And the fact that things are leaking that a deal between the Rockets and Tari is potentially doable by the October deadline, that leads me to agree with you, Paolo. It's probably a pretty small gap and a deal is likely going to get done. It's just a matter of time. Maybe I hadn't considered what you threw out, Paolo, as far as the idea that maybe Tari and his agent are waiting for the restricted free agents from this class to have their situations resolved so that they can factor those numbers into negotiations. That's absolutely real. And perhaps also from a leverage standpoint, given whatever Tari can threaten by waiting until 2026, there's multiple ways you can look at it. But yeah, that could be another reason for waiting. But yeah, reading between the tea leaves, my guess is that the deal gets done. My guess is that it's not 5 years, because I think if Tari was wanting to go down that path, there would likely be a deal very similar to the one that the Rockets agreed to with Jabari that was done already around the same time. My guess is that it's something in between, something a little more creative, but the gap is small enough to where it can probably be bridged and a deal ultimately gets done. That's my bet. However, I suspect it probably takes until October. That's not sourced, just my guess reading the tea leaves, or at least until those restricted free agent situations get resolved, maybe closer to training camp, which starts at the end of September. Anyway, I think that's where we'll wrap things for today. And if you want more content before our next show, we should be back in early to mid-September. I mentioned it being the dead period, so we'll have some interview-based shows. But there is Eurobasket, and so Alperen Şengün is playing for Turkey. So it's not that there's no basketball. Maybe Şengün goes on a great run. And so if he does, we'll have that to react to. But regardless, we'll have some content for you in September before things get really, really ramped up at the end of the month. The 29th is Media Day. The 30th is the opening of training camp. And then preseason opens on October 6th. So even though it's quiet now, we are just about a month away from things getting really real. And then October 21st is obviously the start of the regular season. And October 20th, the day before that, is the deadline for rookie scale contract extensions, most notably Tari Eason here in Houston, as we've been discussing for the past hour plus. Anyway, that will do it for today. And if you want more content before that next show, whenever it is, the best place to get it is online. You can follow me on social media at Ben Dubose, Paolo on there at Paolo Alves NBA, and this show at The Logger Line. If you go to The Logger Line's page on Twitter or X, you can find our link tree, which has got all the links to distribution partners like Apple, YouTube, and Spotify. If you're kind enough to subscribe, leave a positive review at your location of choice. We'd greatly appreciate that. And also on that same link tree, you can find links to friends, sponsors, partners of the program, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carbine Brewing, Sports Talk 790. Hit up those links and you can enjoy their content as well. All right, with the plugs complete, we'll adjourn for tonight. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.